I spent 30 years of my life running toward the things that everyone else was running away from. As a battalion chief for the Charleston Fire Department, I'd seen the worst things a human being can witness. I'd smelled the metallic tang of blood on hot pavement and felt the searing heat of a backdraft that threatened to melt the visor off my helmet. You don't do that kind of work for 3 decades without it leaving a mark on you, both inside and out. My hands are mapped with the faint white lines of old burns, and there's a stiffness in my gait that the damp South Carolina air likes to remind me of every morning. But I took pride in those marks. They were the price of a life lived in service. I never expected that the cruelest blow I'd ever receive wouldn't come from a collapsing roof or a flashover. It would come from a woman in a cream-colored silk dress, standing in the foyer of the home I'd spent my entire life protecting. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon prepping the house on Trad Street. It's an old Federalist-style home, one of the few that stayed in the Sterling family for 3 generations. My late wife, Eleanor, used to say the house had a soul, and after she passed 5 years ago, I made it my mission to keep that soul alive. I'd polished the mahogany sideboard until I could see my own weathered reflection in it. I'd set the table with the heavy sterling silver, the irony of the name never lost on me, and prepared a beef tenderloin that had been marinating since yesterday. My son, Julian, was coming over to introduce me to his fiancée, Sloane Vance. He'd been seeing her for 6 months, and the way he talked about her made him sound like a man who had finally found water in a desert. Julian was a good kid, but he'd always been a bit soft, a bit too eager to please. Since his divorce 2 years ago, he'd been adrift. Now, he was anchored again, or so I thought. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and straightened my collar. I wanted to be the father he was proud of. I wanted to show this woman that she was joining a family with deep roots and solid foundations. When I opened the heavy oak door, the humidity of the Charleston evening pushed its way inside, followed by the scent of expensive, cloying perfume. Julian stood there, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him, and beside him was Sloane. She was beautiful in a sharp, crystalline way, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and eyes the color of the Atlantic before a storm. "Dad, this is Sloane," Julian said, his voice hitching slightly. I reached out a hand, a genuine smile forming on my face. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Sloane." Julian hasn't stopped talking about. She didn't take my hand. Instead, she looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the faint, jagged scar that runs from my jawline down toward my collarbone, a souvenir from a warehouse fire in Chinwitam. A small, mocking smirk played on her lips. "My God, Julian," she said, her voice like a velvet razor. "At least you won't need to buy a mask for the fundraiser in October. You're scary enough as it is, Arthur. Do the children in the neighborhood throw rocks, or do they just run?" The words hit me with the force of a physical punch. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Julian, waiting for the defense, waiting for the "Sloane, that's enough," or the "Dad, she's just joking." But Julian just let out a weak, pathetic little chuckle, his face turning a bright, ashamed red. He wouldn't look at me. "She's got a wicked sense of humor, Dad," Julian stammered. "You know how it is." "I know how a lot of things are, Julian," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "Come in, dinner is on the table." I turned my back on them, not because I was finished with the conversation, but because I didn't want them to see the way my hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden, cold realization that I had let a predator into my sanctuary. As we moved into the dining room, the atmosphere didn't improve. Sloane didn't walk through my home. She appraised it. Her eyes skipped over the family photos, the hand-carved molding, and the antique rugs, settling instead on the cracks in the plaster near the ceiling or the slight wear on the chair legs. Julian mentioned this was a historic property, Sloane said, sitting down before I could even offer her a chair. She ran a manicured fingernail across the mahogany table. "In Savannah, we call this deferred maintenance. It's a charming little museum you've got here, Arthur, but I imagine it's quite a burden for a man of your vintage." "This house has been in my family since Motngin Chin Chum Hai Mui," I replied, carving the tenderloin with precise, controlled movements. I was a fire chief. I knew how to stay calm when the world was burning. "It's not a burden, it's a legacy." Sloane took a microscopic bite of the meat, chewed it as if she were testing it for poison, and set her fork down. "Legacy is just another word for outdated." We were looking at the floor plans Julian sketched from memory. "There's so much wasted square footage. That formal parlor? It's a tomb. We were thinking that once we're settled, we could knock out that load-bearing wall and create a more open-concept living space. Something white, something modern. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. Once you're settled? Settled where, Sloane? Julian cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze by focusing intensely on his wine glass. Well, Dad, we've been talking. Prices in the French Quarter are astronomical right now. And you're here all alone, in this massive place. It seems inefficient. We thought we could move in after the wedding. We'd take the top 2 floors, and you could stay in the garden suite. We'd even pay for the renovations. Sloane has a designer friend who specializes in erasing the past. The room went silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the clock my father had wound every morning for 40 years. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised on stories of honor and sacrifice, and I saw a stranger. He was leaning toward her, physically gravitating into her orbit, already surrendering the ground he stood on. I'm not moving into the garden suite of my own home, Julian, I said, my voice deathly quiet. And nobody is erasing the past in this house. Sloane leaned back, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. She wasn't offended. She was enjoying this. She liked the friction. Arthur, let's be practical. You're a retired civil servant. Your pension can't possibly cover the property taxes on a Trad Street estate much longer. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're acting like a squatter. We're offering you a way to keep a roof over your head while we actually put this asset to work. This isn't an asset, I snapped, the fire finally licking at my patience. It's a home, and as long as I'm breathing, it stays exactly as it is. Sloane's smile didn't falter, it just got sharper. Well, as long as you're breathing is a variable, isn't it? Julian, darling, I think your father needs some time to process. The elderly don't handle change well. It's a cognitive thing. She stood up, smoothing her dress. She hadn't finished her dinner. She hadn't even finished her first glass of wine. She had come here for one reason, to mark her territory and see if the old dog still had teeth. We'll leave you to your memories, Arthur, she said, glancing at the burn scar on my neck one last time. Try not to let the shadows scare you tonight, though I suppose you're used to looking in the mirror. Julian stood up, looking torn, but when Sloane touched his arm, he folded. He gave me a quick, apologetic nod, a coward's goodbye, and followed her out. I stood at the window and watched them walk down the sidewalk. Sloane was talking animatedly, gesturing toward the upper windows of my house, probably already deciding which walls to tear down. Julian was nodding, his head bowed. I didn't clear the table. I didn't wash the dishes. I went to my study, the room that smelled of old leather and tobacco, and I sat in the dark. My mind kept replaying that moment at the door. At least you won't need a mask. I reached up and touched the scar on my neck. I remembered the night I got it. I remembered the screaming, the black smoke, and the way the world felt like it was melting. I had almost died that night to save someone I didn't even know. And now, this woman was walking into my life, treating my sacrifice like a punchline and my home like a line item on a balance sheet. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. I'd spent 30 years assessing structures for weaknesses. I knew how to find the flaw in the foundation that would make the whole thing come tumbling down. Sloane Vance thought she was playing a game of real estate. She thought she was dealing with a tired old man who would roll over for the sake of his son's happiness. She had no idea that I had spent my career studying how things burn. I started writing. Names, dates, details. I needed to know who Sloane Vance really was. A woman that polished, that aggressive, usually had a history she was trying to outrun. And in a town like Charleston, secrets were the only thing more common than the humidity. I was 3 pages into my notes when the phone rang. It was muy mort. Pas muy bien. I picked it up, expecting Julian to be calling to apologize. Hello? Dad? Julian's voice was hushed, frantic. Julian, if you're calling about tonight. No, Dad, listen. I'm at Sloane's place. She's furious. She says, if you don't agree to the trust transfer by the end of the week, she's calling off the wedding. She says she won't marry into a family that doesn't respect her vision. Dad, please. It's just a house. You have to give her what she wants, or I'm going to lose her. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My son wasn't just being manipulated. He was being held hostage. I'm not giving her anything, Julian, and you need to open your eyes. "You don't understand," he hissed. "You don't know what she's capable of. Just look at the mail tomorrow. She said she sent you a preview of what happens if you fight her." He hung up before I could ask what he meant. I sat there in the silence of the Sterling Manor, the house I loved, and I felt a chill that went straight to the bone. I didn't know it yet, but the fire had already started, and this time, I wasn't going to be the one putting it out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my study, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant, low hum of the city. My mind was a chaotic replay of the evening, the way Sloane's eyes had raked over my home like it was already a carcass she was ready to skin, and the hollow, echoing sound of my son's laughter when she insulted my face. Julian used to be a boy who would cry if he saw a bird with a broken wing. Now, he was standing by while a woman tried to break his father. As the sun began to bleed a hazy, humid orange over the Cooper River, I walked down to the end of my driveway. The morning air was thick enough to chew, smelling of salt marsh and old stone. I opened the heavy iron mailbox, my heart thudding against my ribs with a rhythm I hadn't felt since my last alarm call. Inside, tucked between a gardening catalog and a power bill, was a thick, professional-looking envelope. The return address made my blood run cold. Vance, Associates, Architectural Preservation and Development. It wasn't a letter from a friend, it was a manifesto. I took it back to the kitchen, my hands steadier now that I had a physical enemy to face. Inside was a set of high-resolution renderings of Sterling Manor. But it wasn't my house anymore. In the images, the ivy had been stripped from the brick. The century-old oak door had been replaced by a slab of black steel and glass. The interior walls, the ones that held the height markings of Julian's growth and the echoes of Eleanor's piano playing, were gone. It looked like a high-end boutique hotel, sterile and cold. Tucked behind the photos was a document titled Proposal for Interfamily Property Transfer. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a legal framework, already drafted, waiting for a signature. It detailed how the house would be moved into a trust controlled by Julian and Sloane, citing my long-term care needs and the necessity of preserving the asset from the costs of aging. They weren't just asking for the house, they were already filing the paperwork to declare me a ward of my own estate. I didn't know it yet, but Sloane hadn't just done her homework on the house. She had done her homework on how to dismantle a man's life. I spent the next few hours walking through the rooms, touching the things they wanted to discard. I stopped in front of the portrait of Eleanor in the hallway. She had died of a sudden aggressive cancer 5 years ago. This house was the last place that still smelled like her. A faint trace of lavender and old books in the linen closet. The way the floorboard in the nursery creaked in exactly the same way it did when she used to rock Julian to sleep. Julian had always been the sensitive one. When I was pulling double shifts at the station, Eleanor was his world. When she died, something in him seemed to snap. He became desperate for a tether, something to hold on to so he wouldn't float away. I realized then that Sloane Vance hadn't just found a husband. She'd found a vacuum, and she had filled it with her own poison. Around noon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I drove down to King Street to a small, overpriced coffee shop where I knew Julian went every day before heading to his architectural firm. I found him sitting in a corner, staring at his laptop, a designer espresso in his hand that cost more than my first week's wages as a rookie. He looked up when I approached, and for a second, I saw the old Julian, the flash of guilt, the flicker of the boy who used to hide his vegetables under his napkin. But then his face hardened, smoothed over by the influence of the woman who was clearly rewriting his DNA. "Dad," he said, not standing up, "I assumed you'd get the packet." "I got it, Julian. It's quite a piece of fiction." I sat down across from him, my presence feeling heavy and out of place in the sea of young professionals in linen suits. "When did you decide that your father was a long-term care project?" Julian sighed, a sound of practiced exasperation. "Sloane is just being realistic, Dad. You're 62. You've had 2 heart procedures. You spent 30 years breathing in toxic smoke. We're just trying to secure your future before you can't make those decisions for yourself." "I am making a decision right now," I said, leaning in. "The answer is no. To the trust, to the renovations, and to the idea of you moving in to watch over me. I don't need a nurse, and I certainly don't need an architect to tell me how to live in my own skin." Julian's eyes darted toward the door, and I saw his posture stiffen. I didn't have to turn around to know who had just walked in. The air in the shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Arthur," Sloane's voice purred from behind me. "I see you've decided to be difficult. It's such a cliché, really." The aging lion clinging to his dusty den. She slid into the booth next to Julian, her movements as fluid as a snake. She was dressed for a board meeting, sharp lines, monochromatic, intimidating. She didn't look like a bride-to-be, she looked like a CEO mid-acquisition. "I'm not clinging, Sloane," I said, meeting her cold gaze. "I'm standing." "There's a difference." She laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, you're just an obstacle. Julian and I have a vision for our life, and that house is the cornerstone of it. It's worth $7 million in the current market, and you're letting it rot because you're sentimental about some molding and old memories." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's always about the money, Arthur. Especially when you don't have enough of it to keep the lights on for another decade." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't reach the tables around us. "We've already spoken to Dr. Aris at the medical center. Julian mentioned your memory lapses lately. The way you forgot the stove was on last month. The way you got lost, coming home from the pharmacy. It's all being documented." My heart skipped. I never forgot a stove. I've never been lost a day in my life. I was a fire chief. For God's sake, I could navigate a burning building in total darkness. Sloane smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Your word against a concerned son's, Arthur. Who do you think the court is going to believe? A decorated hero with a history of smoke-induced lung damage and early-onset confusion, or a successful young couple trying to provide a safe environment for their father?" I looked at Julian. "You told her I had memory lapses. Julian, I've never even had a headache." Julian looked at his coffee, his voice a pathetic mumble. You did forget where you put your keys last week, Dad, and you seemed confused about the date." Sloane said it's better to be proactive. The betrayal felt like a slow-acting poison spreading through my veins. My own son was helping her build a cage for me. They weren't just trying to take the house. They were trying to take my mind, my reputation, my very autonomy. "You're overreaching, Sloane," I said, my voice vibrating with a suppressed rage. "You think because you have a fancy last name and a law degree that you can steamroll me? You've forgotten who you're talking to." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to," she snapped, her mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the jagged edges beneath. "I'm talking to a man who is one bad day away from a state-run facility. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Sign the trust, let us move in, and we'll make sure you have a very comfortable room in the garden suite. Fight us, and I will make sure you spend your final years in a room that smells like bleach and despair." I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. Every eye in the coffee shop was on us. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the old fireline instinct telling me to strike, to move, to neutralize the threat. But I stayed calm. I had to. "Dinner is over, Sloane," I said, "and so is this conversation." I walked out of the shop, the Charleston sun hitting me like a physical weight. I drove home in a daze, the word bleach and despair echoing in my head. I needed to think. I needed a plan. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The side gate to the garden was slightly ajar. I always lock it. Always. I walked toward the house, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass key in my pocket. As I stepped onto the porch, I saw a smudge of white powder on the windowsill drywall dust. Someone had been in the house. While I was at the coffee shop being threatened with a mental competency hearing, someone had been inside my home. I pushed the door open, my boots silent on the hardwood. The house felt different. The air felt disturbed. I checked the living room, nothing seemed missing. The kitchen, everything in its place. But when I walked into my study, my heart stopped. The framed photograph of Eleanor on my desk was turned face down. And next to it, resting on my blotter, was a small, high-tech device, a black puck no bigger than a silver dollar, a listening device. But that wasn't the worst part. I looked up at the wall where my department commendations hung. My Medal of Valor, the one I'd received for the Motngin Chin Chum Chin Muitam warehouse fire, had been tampered with. The glass was cracked, and tucked behind the ribbon was a small, handwritten note in elegant, looping script. "The fire next time won't have a hero, Arthur. Clock's ticking." I stood there, the note trembling in my hand, as the realization washed over me. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was a war of total destruction. And as I looked at the hidden camera, I suddenly spotted blinking red from the bookshelf. I realized they were watching me at that very second, waiting for me to break. I didn't break. Instead, I looked directly into the tiny lens and did something they didn't expect. I smiled. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that to beat a monster, I had to remember exactly how I used to hunt them in the dark. But first, I had to figure out why Sloane Vance was so obsessed with a fire that happened 25 years ago, a fire I had almost forgotten. I didn't tear the camera down. I didn't smash the listening device with a hammer, though every muscle in my body screamed to do just that. In the fire service, we have a term called situational awareness. You don't just look at the fire, you look at the structure, the fuel load, the wind direction. You look at what the fire is trying to do before it does it. Sloane and Julian wanted a show? Fine, I'd give them a performance worthy of the Dock Street Theater. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the house with a slight, practiced stagger. I mumbled to myself, loud enough for the hidden microphones to catch. I stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes staring at a box of cereal like I couldn't remember what it was for. I even left the back door unlocked, an accident that would look like the beginning of the end for a man of my age. But while my body was playing the part of a fading old man, my mind was a steel trap, snapping shut on every memory of that 1998 warehouse fire. The note had mentioned a hero. It had mentioned the fire next time. That meant this wasn't just a property grab, it was a debt being called in, a debt I didn't even know I owed. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across Trad Street. I made a show of turning off the lights and heading to bed at home p.m. I climbed the stairs, entered my bedroom, and closed the door. Then, I sat on the edge of my bed in total darkness for 20 minutes, listening. No footsteps, no cars idling outside. Just the heavy, humid silence of an old house. I reached under my bed and pulled out a battered metal lockbox. I hadn't opened it since the day I retired. Inside weren't just medals or commendations. It held the after-action reports from the fires that haunted me. I thumbed through the manila folders until I found it. September 14, 1998. The Vance Logistics Warehouse. 5-alarm fire. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I read the names. The warehouse hadn't belonged to a stranger. It had belonged to Preston Vance III, Sloane's father. At the time, the city called it a tragedy. A massive electrical short had turned a 3-story brick warehouse into a chimney in under 10 minutes. I was the captain on Engine Bone back then. I remembered the heat it was, the kind of heat that turned your turnouts black and cracked your breathing mask. I'd gone in against orders. I'd heard a child's voice, a high, thin wail coming from the second-floor offices. I'd crawled through the blackest smoke I'd ever seen, my lungs screaming, and found a little girl huddled under a mahogany desk. She was 7 or 8, her hair singed, her eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. I'd carried her out just as the roof gave way. The scar on my neck, that was the brand the Vance family had left on me that night. A falling beam had grazed me, the heat searing the skin right off my throat. But the report in my hand held a detail I'd buried deep. After the rescue, the arson investigators had found something. The fire hadn't been an accident. There were traces of accelerant in the basement. Accelerant that matched the chemical signature of the cleaning supplies the warehouse specialized in. The city had moved to indict Preston Vance for insurance fraud. He was a pillar of Charleston society, old money royalty, whose lineage went back to the original settlers. The scandal had been a localized earthquake. But the star witness, the man who had found the point of origin while crawling through the flames, was me. My testimony had stripped Preston Vance of his dignity, his fortune, and eventually, his life. He'd suffered a massive stroke in the courtroom the day the verdict was read. He died 3 weeks later in a state-run hospital, the very kind of place Sloane was now threatening to send me. I didn't know it yet, but the little girl I'd pulled from the fire wasn't grateful. She'd spent 25 years marinating in a different kind of heat. The next morning, the performance continued. I drove my old truck down to a diner on Broad Street called the Rusty Anchor. It was a place where old-timers went to talk about the weather and the good old days. I sat in a back booth and waited for a man named Cappy Miller. Cappy had been the lead arson investigator on the Vance case. He was 80 now, his skin like parchment paper, but his eyes were still as sharp as a forensic kit. "Arthur," he wheezed, sliding into the booth. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or maybe you're just looking in the mirror too much." I need to know about the Vance girl, Cappy, the one I pulled out of the warehouse. Cappy went quiet. He signaled the waitress for coffee and didn't speak until the steam was rising between us. Sloane Vance. After her father died, the mother took her to Savannah. Changed their name for a while. They lived on the scraps of whatever wasn't seized by the bank. I heard the girl was difficult, brilliant, but sharp, like a piece of glass you don't see until you're bleeding. She's back, Cappy. She's engaged to Julian. Cappy's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at me with a pity that made my stomach turn. Lord, Arthur, you really are in the thick of it, aren't you? She's trying to take the house. She's gaslighting me, setting up cameras, trying to prove I'm incompetent. She wants me in a home. Cappy leaned in, his voice a low rasp. It's not just about the house, Arthur. That girl grew up watching her father's empire crumble because of a hero firefighter. She didn't see a man saving her life. She saw a man destroying her world. In her head, you didn't rescue her. You kidnapped her into a life of poverty. I saved her life, I hissed, the anger finally bubbling over. To a Vance, Arthur, a life without money isn't a life worth living. You took the silver out of her mouth and replaced it with soot. If she's back, she's not here for a wedding. She's here for a scalp. I left the diner feeling like the world was tilted on its axis. I drove home, my mind racing. I needed to warn Julian. I needed him to see the monster he was sleeping next to. But when I pulled into my driveway, Julian's car was already there, and so was a white van with Elite Moving, Storage, printed on the side. I sprinted into the house, my heart hammering. The front door was wide open. The hallway, usually filled with the quiet dignity of my family's history, was a chaotic mess of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. What the hell is going on? I shouted. Julian appeared from the dining room. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He was holding a stack of my grandmother's china. Dad, don't get upset. Sloane said it was better to start early. We're just moving some of the clutter to a storage unit. It'll make the renovations go faster. I told you no. Get these people out of my house. Sloane stepped out from behind Julian, holding a clipboard. She looked perfectly calm, almost bored. Now, Arthur, remember what we talked about? The stress isn't good for your heart. And besides, Julian already signed the temporary occupancy agreement. As his future spouse and co-trustee of the Sterling Legacy Fund, I have every right to be here. The what? I looked at Julian. What legacy fund? Julian wouldn't look at me. It's for the taxes, Dad. Sloane said the house was in danger of being seized by the city for back taxes. She said if I signed into the fund, her family's lawyers could protect it. There are no back taxes, Julian. I paid them in January. Sloane stepped closer, her perfume so strong it made my head swim. She leaned in, her voice a poisonous honey. Are you sure, Arthur? Or did you just think you paid them? Because the city records say otherwise. Of course, those records are digital now. A bit more reliable than a man who hides cameras in his own bookshelves because he thinks people are watching him. She knew. She knew. I'd found the cameras. She was turning my own defense against me. If I accused her of spying, she'd use it as proof of my paranoia. Get out, I said, my voice shaking with a rage that felt like it could level the city. We're not going anywhere, Arthur, Sloane said, clicking her pen. In fact, we've decided to move the timeline up. We're moving in tonight. The third floor is already cleared. Oh, and Arthur? I'd be careful with that. Memory of yours. You seem to have forgotten something very important. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, charred piece of wood. It was a fragment of a mahogany desk, the same desk I'd found her under 25 years ago. What happened next changed everything, because she didn't just have a piece of the past. She had a witness. Sloane smiled, a slow, terrifying spread of white teeth. Julian, darling, why don't you tell your father who came by the office today? The man who used to be his best friend at the fire station? Julian looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Dad, it was Garrett Miller, he said. He said he has the original logs. He said you didn't just save Sloane that night. He said you started the fire to make yourself look like a hero because you were passed over for promotion. The room went cold. Garrett Miller, my old lieutenant, the man I'd caught stealing from the department fund 10 years ago and had fired. Sloane had found the one man in Charleston who hated me as much as she did, and she hadn't just bought his silence, she'd bought his lies. You're framed, Arthur, Sloane whispered, so low Julian couldn't hear. And by the time I'm through, Even your son will be testifying against you." I looked at my son, and for the first time in 62 years, I felt a fear that I couldn't extinguish. I was being consumed from the inside out, and the only person who could save me was currently packing my life into a box. But as Sloane turned to bark an order at a mover, I saw something in her bag, a glimpse of a legal document with a seal I recognized. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't even about the fire. The real betrayal was something I hadn't even imagined, and if I didn't find out what it was in the next 24 hours, I wouldn't just lose my home, I'd lose my life. The silence that followed Sloane's accusation was heavier than the smoke I'd inhaled for 3 decades. Garrett Miller. The name tasted like ash in my mouth. I'd spent my career upholding the integrity of the department, and Garrett had been the one rot in the wood. I'd caught him siphoning funds from the Widows and Orphans Fund, a sin unforgivable in our line of work. I'd stripped him of his badge and his pension, and now, 10 years later, he was the match Sloane was using to burn my life to the ground. "Dad, Garrett showed me the logs," Julian said, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "He said the fire at the Vance warehouse didn't start in the basement. He said it started in the stairwell right after you entered the building. He said you used a road flare." I looked at my son, and for a fleeting second, I wanted to shake him until his teeth rattled. "Julian, Garrett Miller is a thief and a liar. I fired him for stealing from dead men's families. You're going to take the word of a disgraced convict over the father who raised you?" Sloane stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a judge's gavel. "It's not just his word, Arthur. He has the original logs. The ones you supposedly lost in the filing error of Chin. It's funny how things resurface when the right person starts digging." She signaled to the movers, and they began hauling my grandmother's Victorian settee toward the truck. It felt like watching my own limbs being carried away. This house was a fortress of memories, and Sloane was dismantling the battlements one piece of furniture at a time. "Stop," I commanded, my voice echoing with the authority of a man who used to command 100 men on a fire line. "Julian, tell them to stop." Julian looked at Sloane, his eyes pleading for permission, but she just tightened her grip on his arm. "Don't listen to him, darling. He's having one of his episodes." The confusion, the aggression. Dr. Aris warned us this would happen as the cognitive decline accelerated. "I am not declining," I roared. Sloane didn't flinch. She just tapped her clipboard. "Check the pantry, Julian. See if your father remembered to buy groceries this week, or if he's been eating expired cans again." Julian hurried to the kitchen, and I followed, desperate to prove her wrong. But when he opened the pantry door, my heart plummeted. The shelves, which I had stocked with fresh supplies just 2 days ago, were filled with rusted, dented cans of peaches and soup from a decade ago. Labels were peeling. Some were covered in a fine layer of gray dust. I stared at them, my mind reeling. I knew what I'd bought. I had the receipt in my pocket, or I thought I did. I reached into my trousers, but my fingers found only a crumpled, blank piece of paper. I didn't buy these," I whispered, the first seeds of genuine doubt beginning to sprout in my gut. "You see, Julian?" Sloane whispered, her voice a terrifying blend of pity and triumph. "He doesn't even remember the swap. He's living in a reality that doesn't exist anymore." I looked at Sloane, and for a second, the mask of the polished socialite slipped. In the reflection of the pantry's glass door, I saw her watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had moved the groceries. She had planted the old cans. She was orchestrating a symphony of madness, and I was the only one who could hear the music. By nightfall, the 3rd floor of Sterling Manor had been transformed. My old guest rooms, where Julian used to sleep during summer breaks, were stripped of their warmth. Sloane had moved in her minimalist, cold furniture. The smell of lavender and old books was replaced by the scent of industrial cleaner and her suffocating perfume. I was relegated to the 1st floor, a prisoner in my own parlor. Every time I tried to head upstairs, I found the door to the landing locked. "For your safety, Arthur," Julian said through the wood, his voice muffled and thick with a guilt he couldn't quite suppress. "We don't want you wandering in the night and falling down the stairs. Sloane says it's for the best." I sat in my study, the hidden camera still blinking its rhythmic red eye from the bookshelf. I knew they were watching. I knew they were waiting for me to scream, to break a window, to give them the evidence they needed to call the paramedics and have me hauled away in a straitjacket. But I sat perfectly still. I didn't know it yet, but the document I'd seen in Sloane's bag earlier was the key to the entire structure. I'd caught a glimpse of a header, Standard Chartered Foreclosure Notice. The realization hit me like a backdraft. Sloane Vance wasn't the wealthy heiress she pretended to be. Vance Associates wasn't a thriving firm. It was a sinking ship. She didn't want my house for a vision. She needed the equity to pay off a mountain of debt. She was a scavenger, and I was the prey. I waited until I heard the floorboards groan upstairs, the specific creak that meant Julian had gone to bed. I knew Sloane would stay up later, her mind too busy weaving webs to rest. I moved to my desk and pulled out a hidden compartment Eleanor and I had built years ago for our emergency fund. Inside wasn't just cash. It was a secondary set of keys and a micro-cassette recorder I'd kept from my days as an investigator. I slipped out of the study and moved toward the back of the house, toward the garden suite. If Sloane was broke, she'd be making calls. A woman like her couldn't breathe without a conspiracy. I pressed my ear to the vent that connected the library to the upstairs master suite. I stayed there for an hour, my knees aching, the damp Charleston night air seeping through the floorboards. Then, I heard it. A muffled ring, followed by Sloane's voice, sharp, cold, and stripped of the southern charm she used to manipulate Julian. "I don't care what the bank says, Marcus," she hissed. "I'll have the signature by the end of the month. The old man is crumbling faster than I expected. I've already got the son convinced he's a pyromaniac. Once the mental competency hearing is over, I'll liquidate the Trad Street property and the Piedmont holdings. You'll get your pound of flesh." A pause. Then her voice turned even darker. "If he doesn't sign, then we move to phase 2. Garrett says he can provide a hot enough witness to put Arthur in a cell for the rest of his life. A jail cell or a padded cell, I don't care which. Just get the creditors off my back for another 2 weeks. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Phase 2. She wasn't just looking to take the house. She was willing to send me to prison for a crime I didn't commit, using a man I'd once trusted as the primary witness. But it was the mention of the Piedmont holdings that stopped my heart. Those weren't my assets. Those belonged to Eleanor's family, a trust that was supposed to go directly to Julian on his 35th birthday. Sloane wasn't just stealing from me, she was gutting Julian's entire future, and the boy was holding the knife for her. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that I couldn't just play defense anymore. I had to go on the offensive. I spent the next 2 days leaning into the role of the confused elder. I let my beard grow out. I wore mismatched socks. I even forgot how to use the microwave, letting it beep incessantly until Julian came running. I saw the heartbreak in his eyes, and it nearly broke my resolve. But I had to save him from her, even if it meant he had to hate me for a little while longer. On Thursday, Sloane announced we were having a visitor. "A specialist, Arthur," she said, her eyes gleaming as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "A friend of the family who wants to help you find some peace." The visitor arrived at p.m. It wasn't a doctor. It was a man in a cheap, polyester suit with the predatory eyes of a debt collector. He introduced himself as Silas Vane, a consultant for estate transitions. We sat in the dining room, the room where I had once hosted the mayor and the governor. Now, it felt like an interrogation room. Sloane sat at the head of the table, Julian to her right, and Silas across from me. "Arthur," Silas said, opening a thick leather folder. "I've reviewed the logs provided by Mr. Miller. They're quite damning. Arson is a felony with no statute of limitations when it results in significant injury. You remember the burns the little girl suffered, don't you?" "I remember saving her life," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "That's one interpretation," Silas countered, sliding a photo across the table. It was a picture of Garrett Miller, holding a singed, leather-bound notebook. "Garrett is prepared to testify that he saw you pouring accelerant. He says he kept quiet all these years out of brotherhood, but his conscience finally got the better of him." "His conscience?" I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Garrett Miller doesn't have a conscience. He has a price tag. How much are you paying him, Sloane?" Sloane gasped, clutching Julian's hand. "Julian, you see? The paranoia. He thinks everyone is out to get him." "Dad, please," Julian begged. "Just listen to Silas. He says if we move the house and the Piedmont Trust into the Sterling Protection Group, the authorities will see it as a gesture of goodwill. It might keep you out of a courtroom." "The Sterling Protection Group is a shell company, Julian," I said, looking my son directly in the eye. "It's a black hole where our family history will go to die so Sloane can pay off her gambling debts and her failed Savannah developments." The room went deathly quiet. Sloane's face didn't just pale, it turned a ghastly, translucent white. Her hand, the one holding Julian's, began to shake. "What did you say?" she whispered. "I know about Marcus, Sloane. I know about the foreclosure on the Savannah warehouse, and I know that you're about 30 seconds away from being bankrupt." I stood up, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't stagger. I stood tall, the fire chief back in command. "Julian, look at her. Look at her face, and tell me I'm wrong." Julian looked at Sloane, his expression a mixture of confusion and burgeoning horror. "Sloane, what is he talking about? You said the Savannah project was a success. You said—" "He's lying!" Sloane screamed, her voice losing its melody and turning into a jagged, ugly screech. "He's trying to drive us apart. He's a sick old man who started a fire 25 years ago, and he'll do anything to hide it." She turned to Silas, her eyes wild. "Call them. Call the police. Tell them we have an aggressive, delusional man in the house who is a danger to himself and others. Do it now." Silas reached for his phone, but before he could dial, a heavy knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the rhythmic, authoritative pounding of the law. I looked at the front door, then back at Sloane. She looked like she wanted to vomit. "I didn't call them, Sloane," I said, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. "But someone did, and I don't think they're here for me." What happened next changed the entire trajectory of my life, because when I opened that door, I didn't see the local police. I saw two men in dark suits with federal badges, and they weren't looking for an arsonist from Mukngin Chin Chum Chin Muitam. They were looking for the woman who had been orchestrating a multi-state wire fraud scheme using my family's name. But as the lead agent stepped into the foyer, his eyes skipped over Sloane and landed directly on me. "Arthur Sterling?" he asked. "Yes. You're under arrest for the murder of Garrett Miller. His body was found an hour ago in a warehouse on the Cooper River, and your truck was seen leaving the scene." I looked at Sloane, and through her fear, a slow, dark smile began to spread across her face. She hadn't just framed me for an old fire. She had just committed a murder and made me the lead actor in her final act. The cold bite of the handcuffs was a sensation I hadn't felt in 40 years, not since my academy days when we practiced restraints. Back then, the steel felt like a tool of justice. Now, as it ratcheted shut around my wrists in the foyer of my own home, it felt like a death sentence. I looked at the lead agent, Special Agent Vance, no relation to Sloane, though the irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He didn't see the man who had pulled 42 people from burning buildings. He saw an aging, erratic arsonist who had finally graduated to homicide. "Arthur, oh my God," Sloane's voice rose in a shrill, practiced tremolo. She collapsed into Julian's arms, burying her face in his chest. I knew he was angry. I knew he hated Garrett for what he knew. But this? To kill him? Julian was a ghost. He stood there, his arms mechanically wrapping around the woman who was systematically dismantling our lives, his eyes fixed on the silver bracelets on my wrists. "Dad," he whispered. And the word didn't sound like a call for help. It sounded like a mourning. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth about the fire? Why did you have to go to the warehouse?" "I didn't go to any warehouse, Julian," I shouted, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded desperate, frayed. The confused old man performance I'd been giving for the cameras was now the very thing the agents were documenting as a sign of my instability. I was here. I was in the study. "Check the cameras Sloane installed." Sloane looked up, her eyes swimming with crocodile tears. "The cameras you smashed this morning, Arthur? The ones you said were demons watching you?" I looked at the bookshelf. The red light was gone. The lens was shattered. She had smashed her own equipment while I was forgetting how to use the microwave, creating a window of time where my movements were unrecorded. She was 3 steps ahead, and I was running out of breath. "Move it, Sterling," Agent Vance said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. They marched me out of my house, past the white moving van that was still half full of my family's history. The neighbors were starting to come out onto their porches. Tom from across the street, who I'd shared coffee with for a decade. Mrs. Gable, whose cat I'd rescued from a chimney 3 years ago. They watched in a stunned, ugly silence as the hero of Trad Street was ducked into the back of a black SUV. What happened next was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial floor cleaner, the same smell Sloane had brought into my home, now magnified 1,000 times in the Charleston County Detention Center. They took my belt, my watch, and my dignity. I was dressed in a rough, orange jumpsuit that felt like it was made of sandpaper. In the interrogation room, The air was cold enough to make my old joints ache. Agent Vance sat across from me, tossing a folder onto the metal table. We found the truck, Arthur. Parked 3 blocks from the scene at the Cooper River docks. The keys were in the ignition, and there was blood on the floorboard. Garrett Miller's blood. I haven't driven that truck in 3 days, I said, my voice hollow. I gave the spare keys to Julian weeks ago. Julian says he hasn't seen the keys since Monday. He says you've been misplacing things lately. Vance leaned in, his shadow looming large on the gray wall. Garrett Miller was beaten to death with a heavy blunt object. We found a commemorative fire axe in the bed of your truck, the one with your name engraved on the handle, the one that was missing from your study. I felt the room tilt. The axe. It had been a gift from my crew when I made chief. It was weighted, balanced, and deadly. Sloane hadn't just framed me. She had used my own legacy as the murder weapon. I didn't know it yet, but the trap wasn't just built of lies. It was built of my own pride. I spent 48 hours in a cell, the silence broken only by the clanging of steel doors and the distant, rhythmic sobbing of another inmate. I wasn't allowed to see Julian. My only visitor was a court-appointed attorney named Elias Thorne, a man who looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward and smelled of stale cigarettes. "It's not good, Arthur," Elias said, leaning against the bars. "The evidence is a mountain. The truck, the weapon, the motive. Everyone knows you hated Miller. Everyone knows he was about to blow the whistle on your hero origin story. And the icing on the cake, your son. He's already given a statement about your deteriorating mental state and your violent outbursts regarding the Vance fire. He's being manipulated, Elias. Sloane is bankrupt. She's stealing the estate." Elias sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Maybe, but right now, Sloane Vance looks like a saint. She's offered to pay for your legal defense through a family trust. She's telling everyone she just wants you to get the psychiatric help you need. She's not calling for the needle, Arthur. She's calling for the asylum. And the jury? They'll eat it up. They'd rather believe a hero went crazy than believe a hero was a fraud." "I won't sign anything," I said, my jaw clenching so hard it hurt. "You might not have a choice. If the court declares you incompetent, Julian becomes your legal guardian, and we both know who Julian listens to." Elias left, and I was alone again. I sat on the thin, plastic mattress and looked at the wall. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the house. I thought about the night of the warehouse fire. I realized then that I had been fighting the wrong fire. I had been trying to protect the building, when I should have been protecting the boy. I had raised Julian to be kind, but I hadn't raised him to be strong. And now, his kindness was the very rope Sloane was using to hang me. On the third day, I was brought to a small, private room. I expected Elias. Instead, I found Sloane. She was dressed in a modest, charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a sensible bun. She looked every bit the grieving, burdened daughter-in-law. There were no cameras here, no Julian to perform for. When she looked at me, the mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. "You look terrible, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, melodic purr. "The orange doesn't suit your complexion. It really highlights the scar." "You killed Garrett," I said. It wasn't a question. Sloane smiled, and it was a cold, beautiful thing. Garrett was a greedy little pig. He thought he could double the price of his testimony once he saw the foreclosure notices for my Savannah project. He didn't realize that in my world, when an asset becomes a liability, you liquidate it. "The police will find the truth," I spat. "Will they? They have the murderer, the weapon, and the motive. They have a son who is heartbrokenly certain that his father has lost his mind. And they have a victim who was a disgraced thief. Nobody is looking for another killer, Arthur. They're just looking for a way to close the book on the Sterling scandal." She leaned over the table, her scent, that cloying, expensive perfume filling my lungs. "Here's how this ends. You sign the voluntary commitment papers. You admit that you've been having lapses. You agree to the transfer of the Trad Street property and the Piedmont Trust to the Vance Sterling Foundation. In exchange, I make sure the murder charge is downgraded to diminished capacity. You'll spend the rest of your life in a very nice, very quiet facility in the mountains. You'll have a garden. You'll have your memories. But you will never see Charleston again. And if I don't..." Sloane's eyes turned into chips of blue ice. "Then we go to trial. I'll make sure Julian is the star witness. I'll make him recount every forgotten stove, every confused moment, every time you looked at him and didn't recognize your own son. I'll break his heart on the stand. Arthur." I'll make him watch you be sent to a maximum security prison for the rest of your life. He'll hate you. He'll spend every day for the rest of his life ashamed to carry your name." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She wasn't just offering me a cage. She was offering to destroy the only thing I had left that mattered, my son's love. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that Sloane Vance had one weakness she hadn't accounted for. She thought I was a man who feared the fire. She didn't realize I was the man who knew how to live inside it. I leaned back, my heart beating with a calm, steady rhythm. "Give me the papers, Sloane." Her eyes flared with triumph. She pulled a pen and a set of documents from her bag, sliding them across the table with a trembling excitement. "I knew you were smart, Arthur. For Julian's sake, of course." I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. Arthur Sterling, Chief Rhett. I looked at Sloane. She was leaning in, her breath hitched, her entire future riding on the stroke of my pen. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I used the pen to write 5 words across the top of the document in bold, black letters. "Who is the other girl?" Sloane froze. The triumph in her eyes vanished, replaced by a flicker of something I'd never seen in her before. Pure, unadulterated terror. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a look of confusion, but I'd seen it. I'd spent 30 years reading the way a fire flickers before a backdraft. I knew that look. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I pulled a girl from that warehouse, Sloane, but the records from the hospital that night, they mentioned 2 children being treated for smoke inhalation. One was you. Who was the other one? And why did your father pay $1 million to make sure her name was never mentioned in the arson report?" Sloane grabbed the papers, her movements frantic, jerky. "You're insane. This is exactly what I was talking about. Paranoia. Delusions." She practically ran for the door, signaling the guard to let her out. She didn't look back. I sat in the silence of the room, the 5 words staring back at me from the table. I didn't know who the other girl was. I hadn't even known there was a second child until I'd lied and saw the reaction on Sloane's face. It was a Hail Mary, a desperate reach into the dark, but the way she'd reacted told me everything. Sloane Vance wasn't just a bankrupt socialite. She was a woman built on a foundation of bones, and if I could find out whose bones they were, I could bring her whole world down. But as I was being led back to my cell, the guard leaned in and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Sterling, your son was just involved in a car accident on the Ravenel Bridge. Sloane Vance was driving. They say it doesn't look good." The room went black, and for the first time in my life, I felt the fire finally win. The news of the accident didn't just break my heart, it leveled what was left of my world. I collapsed against the cold cinder block wall of my cell, the guard's words echoing like a siren in a hollow canyon. The Ravenel Bridge, one of the highest points in South Carolina, a soaring expanse of steel and cable that looked like a staircase to heaven on a sunny day, but a sheer drop into a watery grave in a storm. And Sloane had been driving. How bad? I wheezed, the air catching in my throat like I was back in the hold of the Vance warehouse. "Tell me my son is okay." The guard, a man named Miller, who usually looked at me with a mixture of pity and boredom, actually looked away. "They took them to USC. Your son. They say he was unresponsive when the paramedics got there. Sloane Vance walked away with a few scratches. She's claiming the car malfunctioned." A car malfunction. I felt a cold, oily dread settle in the pit of my stomach. Sloane didn't do malfunctions. She did executions. She had seen the terror in my eyes when I mentioned the second girl, and she had realized that Julian was no longer a shield. He was a witness who knew too much about our family history. She had tried to tie up the last loose end on that bridge. "I have to go to him," I said, grabbing the bars. "Call Agent Vance. Call my lawyer. I don't care if you have to chain me to the hospital bed, but I am not letting my son die alone while that monster lurks in the hallway." "I can't do that, Arthur," Miller said quietly. "You're a flight risk, especially now." I spent the next 6 hours in a state of living death. I paced the 6-by-8-foot space until the soles of my feet burned. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to since Eleanor's funeral. I played every memory of Julian in my head, him as a toddler reaching for my helmet, him at his high school graduation, him looking at me with that shattered, disappointed expression in my foyer. I had to save him. I had to get out. But I didn't know it yet. But the person who was going to open my cell door wasn't a guard or a lawyer. It was the ghost I'd been hunting. At Ba, Home AM, The heavy steel door at the end of the block groaned open. I expected the shift change. Instead, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a simple dark trench coat, her hair a messy tangle of chestnut curls. She looked exhausted, haunted, and strangely familiar. She walked up to my bars and stood there, staring at me with eyes that had seen too much smoke. "You're Arthur Sterling," she said. Her voice was thin, raspy, the voice of someone whose vocal cords had been scarred by heat. "Who are you?" I asked, my instincts screaming that this was another of Sloane's traps. "My name is Elena," she whispered. "But 25 years ago, in a warehouse on the Cooper River, you called me sweetheart. You told me to keep my eyes closed and hold on to your neck. You told me you were going to get me out." The world stopped spinning. I moved to the bars, my hands trembling as I reached out toward her. "The other girl. You're the one I found in the office." "I wasn't in the office," Elena said, a single tear tracing a path through the faint, silver-burned scars on her cheek, scars she hadn't hidden with expensive makeup. "I was in the basement. Sloane Vance was the one in the office. She's the one you saw. But I was the one who was supposed to die." I felt the foundation of my memory shift. "I don't understand." The report said there was only one child rescued, the Vance Harris. Elena laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "Preston Vance didn't have one daughter, Arthur. He had two. I was the mistake, the daughter of the housekeeper that he couldn't acknowledge. My mother died in that fire, trying to get to me. And while you were busy being a hero and saving the legitimate Vance child, Preston was paying the department and the hospital to make sure I disappeared. He didn't want a scandal. He wanted a clean slate. He let you burn," I hissed, the horror of it making me nauseous. "He tried, but another firefighter found me. A man named Garrett Miller." The name hit me like a physical blow. Garrett, my lieutenant, the man I'd just been accused of murdering. "Garrett didn't report me," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "He saw an opportunity. He took me out through a service entrance, claimed I was a runaway he found on the street, and he used me as a pension plan. He spent 25 years blackmailing Preston Vance, and then Sloane, using the fact that I was still alive. I was the proof that their father was a monster. I was the reason Sloane was bankrupt. She's been paying Garrett hush money since the day her father died." "That's why she killed him," I whispered. "He got too greedy. He wanted the house, and he wanted to keep the secret." "She didn't just kill him to stop the payments," Elena said, leaning in so close I could smell the faint scent of antiseptic on her coat. "She killed him because I finally ran away. I contacted Julian a week ago. I told him who I was. I told him that the woman he was marrying was a fraud who had been complicit in my disappearance for years." My heart nearly stopped. Julian knew. That was why he looked so haunted. That was why he was being so compliant. He wasn't being fooled. He was being threatened. "Julian tried to help me," Elena said, her voice breaking. "He was going to take me to the police tonight. He was going to give them the documents Garrett had kept in a safety deposit box, the real logs. Arthur, not the fake Sloane used to frame you. Sloane found out. She offered to drive him to the station. She said she wanted to confess. Instead, she drove him onto the bridge. Is he alive?" I grabbed the bars, my knuckles white. "He's in a coma. The doctors don't know if he'll wake up. And Sloane is sitting in the VIP lounge of the hospital, playing the victim, waiting for the news that he's gone so she can inherit everything." I hit rock bottom then. I wasn't just a framed man. I was a man whose son was dying because of a secret I had unknowingly carried for a quarter of a century. I had saved the wrong girl. No, I had saved a girl who grew up to be a devil, and in doing so, I had paved the way for my own son's destruction. "I need those documents, Elena," I said, the fire in my gut reigniting with a cold, blue intensity. "If I'm going down, I'm taking her with me, but I can't do it from here." "I don't have them," she said, looking down at her scarred hands. "Garrett hid them in the one place he knew you'd never look, the one place you hate more than anything." "The warehouse," I whispered, "the ruins of the Vance property." "It's not ruins anymore, Arthur. Sloane started the preservation project there months ago. It's a construction site now. That's where she killed Garrett. And that's where the truth is buried." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She slid it through the bars. It was a key, the master key to the Sterling Manor, the one Sloane had taken from me the night I was arrested. "How did you get this?" "I'm the housekeeper's daughter, remember?" Elena said with a grim smile. "I know how to move through a house without being seen." I took it from her bag while she was sobbing in the hospital waiting room. She looked toward the end of the hall. "The guard, Miller. He's Garrett's cousin. He knows what Sloane did. He's not going to stop you, but he won't help you either. You have 10 minutes before the perimeter cameras reset. If you're going to be the hero everyone says you are, Arthur, now would be the time." What happened next changed everything, because for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't running toward a fire to put it out. I was running toward it to become the spark. I moved through the shadows of the detention center, with the practiced silence of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating through the dark. Miller stood at the exit, his back to me, staring intensely at a flickering monitor. He didn't turn around when I slipped past him. He didn't say a word when the side door clicked shut behind me. The Charleston night was a deluge of rain and thunder, the air thick with the smell of wet pavement and salt. I didn't have my truck. I didn't have my phone. All I had was a key, a broken heart, and a name that was currently being dragged through the mud of every news cycle in the South. I didn't go to the hospital. I knew that if I showed up there, I'd be tackled by a dozen officers before I could even see Julian's face. No, I had to go to the source. I had to go to the warehouse on the Cooper River. I hot-wired a discarded sedan in a parking lot, 3 blocks from the jail, a skill I'd learned from a reformed arsonist years ago, and drove toward the water. The Ravenel Bridge loomed in the distance, its lights blurred by the rain, a silent witness to the attempted murder of my son. As I pulled up to the Vance construction site, I saw the skeleton of the new development rising from the ashes of the old warehouse. It was a ghoulish sight, modern steel beams entwined with the blackened, original brickwork, Sloane's vision. I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through my orange jumpsuit in seconds. I looked like a fugitive. I felt like a ghost. I moved toward the entrance, my eyes scanning the ground for the point of origin, not of a fire, but of a lie. I entered the structure, the air inside still holding that faint, metallic tang of old smoke. I made my way toward the basement, the place where Elena said she had been hidden. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the pools of rainwater on the concrete floor. Then, I saw it. In the far corner, tucked behind a newly poured concrete pillar, was a small, rusted floor safe. The dial had been smashed, but the door was still seated. And standing over it, holding a heavy iron pry bar, was Sloane Vance. She wasn't wearing her charcoal suit anymore. She was in black leggings and a rain slicker, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She looked like a grave robber. She didn't hear me approach. She was too busy grunting as she heaved against the safe door. "Searching for your father's soul, Sloane?" I asked, my voice echoing through the hollow ribs of the building. "Or just the evidence that you're a murderer?" Sloane spun around, the pry bar clattering to the floor. For a split second, she looked terrified. But then, as she realized I was alone, unarmed, and still wearing the uniform of a convict, her face twisted into a mask of pure, jagged malice. "Arthur," she panted, a wild, manic light in her eyes. "You really are a glutton for punishment. You should have stayed in your cell. At least there, the state would have paid for your funeral. Where are the logs, Sloane? Where is the proof that you let your sister burn?" Sloane laughed, a high, thin sound that was lost in the thunder outside. "Sister? Elena was a weed in my father's garden. She was a mistake that should have been erased 25 years ago. And as for the logs, they're right here." She kicked the safe door, and it swung open, revealing a stack of yellowed, water-damaged notebooks. "I'm going to burn them, Arthur. Just like I'm going to burn this whole place down with you inside it. The police will find your body in the rubble of the warehouse you supposedly torched in. Chinmuitam. It's perfect. The arsonist returns to the scene of his greatest crime to finish the job. A suicide out of guilt." She pulled a flare from her pocket, the same kind Garrett Miller had supposedly described in his lies. She struck it, the sudden, brilliant red light illuminating her face like a demon's. "I didn't know it yet, but Sloane had forgotten one thing about me," I said, stepping into the red glow. "I don't just know how things burn. I know how to make the fire speak." What happened next changed the course of my life, because as Sloane went to toss the flare into the safe, the shadows behind her didn't just move, they spoke. "Drop it, Sloane," a voice commanded. A man stepped out from the darkness of the stairwell. He was bloodied, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale as death. It was Julian. The flare in Sloane's hand cast a jagged, rhythmic red light against the walls, making the shadows dance like ghosts in a house of mirrors. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drumming of the rain on the corrugated metal roof and the heavy, ragged breathing of 3 people who had all been left for dead in different ways. Sloane looked at Julian as if she were seeing a phantom. Her jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to unhinge, her face pale and waxy in the crimson glow. Julian leaned against a rusted support beam, his breath coming in shallow, painful rasps. His shirt was torn, soaked through with a mixture of rain and blood, and his left arm hung at a sickening angle. But his eyes, the eyes I thought I'd never see open again, were fixed on Sloane with a clarity that was sharper than any scalpel. He wasn't the soft, easily led boy she had groomed for the past 6 months. He was a man who had stared into the abyss of his own grave and crawled back out. "Julian," Sloane breathed, her voice a fragile whisper that broke on the humid air. You're supposed to be in the ICU, the doctors said." "The doctors said what you told them to say, Sloane," Julian interrupted, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in his legs. "But I didn't stay in the car. I saw your hand on the wheel. I saw the way you looked at me before you jerked the steering toward the pylon. I jumped before we hit the rail. I've been hiding in the marsh under the bridge for 3 hours, waiting for Elena to find me. She's the one who brought me here." I felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly brought me to my knees. My son hadn't just survived, he had played her. He had let her believe her mission was accomplished, so she would lead us right to the boneyard. Sloane's panic lasted only a few seconds before it morphed into something far more dangerous, the cold, calculating rage of a cornered predator. She gripped the flare tighter, the sulphurous smoke curling around her fingers. "It doesn't matter," she hissed. "You're both here now, a fugitive and a dying man. I'll tell the police you broke out of jail to finish the job, Arthur. I'll say you attacked Julian in a fit of rage and I tried to save him. Who are they going to believe? The hero's son who's already mentally unstable from the accident, or the woman who's been trying to hold this family together?" "They'll believe the truth, Sloane," I said, taking a step toward her. The air in the basement was thick and stale, but I knew how to move through it. I'd spent my life in places like this. The truth isn't just in those logs. It's in the recording Julian's been making since the moment you picked him up from the house. Julian pulled a small silver digital recorder from his pocket with his good hand. The red light on the device blinked in unison with the flare. "I heard everything, Sloane. Every word about Garrett, every word about the warehouse in Savannah, and I heard you laugh about what you did to Elena." The mask finally shattered. Sloane didn't just scream, she let out a primal, guttural roar of frustration and threw the flare into the open safe. "I'll burn it all," she shrieked. "I'll burn the logs, I'll burn the evidence, and I'll burn this whole godforsaken legacy to the ground." The dry, brittle paper of the notebooks caught instantly. The flames licked at the ceiling of the safe, fueled by the accelerant Sloane had likely poured in earlier. But she hadn't realized that the basement of an old warehouse isn't just concrete and brick. It's a labyrinth of old, wooden supports, sawdust, and 25 years of accumulated dust that acts like gunpowder. The fire didn't just sit in the safe, it reached out, catching a pile of discarded blueprints on a nearby table. Within seconds, the red glow of the flare was replaced by the hungry, orange light of a growing blaze. "Julian, get out!" I shouted, my internal clock already counting down the seconds until the structure became a chimney. "Go to the car, now." "Not without you, Dad." Sloane didn't run. She lunged for the safe, trying to grab the prying bar to smash the recorder in Julian's hand. She was lost in a frenzy of self-preservation that had turned into self-destruction. I moved to intercept her, but the heat was rising too fast. The smoke was beginning to bank down from the ceiling thick, black, and toxic. It was the same smoke from what Ngin Chin Cham Chin Witam, a ghost returned to finish its work. I didn't know it yet, but my 30 years of service weren't just a career. They were a rehearsal for this exact moment. I didn't think about the murder charge. I didn't think about the handcuffs or the orange jumpsuit. I became the chief again. I grabbed Sloane by the waist, hauling her away from the safe just as a wooden beam above us groaned and fractured. "Let me go," she screamed, clawing at my face, her nails drawing blood across my old scar. "I'm not losing. I'm a Vance. I don't lose to people like you." "You already lost, Sloane," I grunted, pinning her arms. "The moment you thought you could use a fire to hide the truth, you lost." I looked at Julian. He was staggering toward the stairs, his face pale, the smoke already beginning to choke him. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the eyes of every victim I'd ever pulled from a wreck. He was fading. Julian, follow the light of the entrance. Don't stop. The warehouse groaned. The steel beams, stressed by the sudden intense heat, began to warp. In a fire, the building is alive. It breathes, it screams, and eventually, it collapses. I had to get them both out, but Sloane was fighting me with the strength of a madwoman. Look at it, Arthur. She laughed, her eyes reflecting the growing inferno. It's 1998 all over again. This time you can't be the hero. This time, everyone burns. Yeah. A sudden explosion of heat from the safe sent a shower of sparks into the air. The secondary supports caught. The basement was turning into an oven. I felt the familiar sear of heat on my neck, the old scar pulsing with a sympathetic pain. I had a choice. I could stay and try to save the logs, or I could save my son. I didn't hesitate. The logs were paper. Julian was my blood. I shoved Sloane toward the stairs. Move, or I'll leave you here to see how well a Vance burns. She scrambled up the steps, her ambition finally overridden by the basic human instinct to survive. I followed close behind, my hand on the railing, which was already hot to the touch. We reached the first floor, but the fire had beat us there. The central staircase was a column of flame. The preservation project, with its new lumber and open floor plans, was nothing but a massive pile of kindling. I saw Julian near the loading dock door. He had collapsed, the smoke too much for his battered lungs. I sprinted toward him, my boots thudding against the plywood subflooring. Julian, wake up. I scooped him up, his weight familiar, the same weight as the girl I'd carried 25 years ago, but heavier with the burden of my own failures. Sloane was ahead of us, reaching for the door, but the exit was blocked by a falling section of the ceiling. She shrieked, backing away, as the flames cut off her escape. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, pathetic plea for help. The predator was gone. Only the coward remained. Arthur, please, don't leave me. I looked at the fire, then at my son, then at the woman who had tried to destroy us. Every instinct told me to let the building take her. It would be justice. It would be poetic. But I wasn't an arsonist. I was a firefighter. Grab his feet, I commanded. What? I said, grab his feet. We're going out the side window. Sloane obeyed, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip Julian's ankles. Together, we hauled him toward a high, narrow window at the back of the warehouse. I smashed the glass with my elbow, the cool, rain-soaked air rushing in like a blessing. I pushed Julian through first, watching as he landed on a pile of soft sand outside. Then I grabbed Sloane by the collar and shoved her through. I stood alone in the burning warehouse for one final second. The heat was a physical wall, pushing against my chest. I looked back at the basement stairs. The logs were gone. The physical evidence of Sloane's fraud was ash. But as I felt the recorder in Julian's pocket in my mind, I knew we didn't need the paper. I dived through the window just as the roof of the Vance warehouse finally gave way with a sound like a freight train crashing. I hit the mud and rolled, the rain extinguishing the embers on my jumpsuit. I scrambled to my feet, dragging Julian further away from the heat. Across the lot, Sloane was huddled in the dirt, sobbing, her face blackened with soot. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers were already reflecting in the puddles. They hadn't come because of a call from the station. They had come because the entire Cooper River waterfront was illuminated by the death of the Vance legacy. Agent Vance stepped out of the lead car, his gun drawn, but he stopped when he saw me kneeling over Julian. He saw the orange jumpsuit, the fire behind me, and the recording device that Julian was now clutching as he coughed and sputtered back to consciousness. Arthur? Vance asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. I didn't kill Garrett Miller, Agent Vance, I said, my voice rasping but clear. And I didn't start the fire in Chinwitam, but I did just save your primary witness, twice. I looked at Sloane. She was being hauled up by 2 officers. She looked at the burning building, the millions of dollars in debt, the lies, and the murder of Garrett Miller, all going up in a pyre she had built herself. She didn't look scary anymore. She looked small. What happened next changed everything, because I realized that the end of the fire isn't the end of the story. It's just where the cleaning begins. Julian gripped my hand, his fingers weak but certain. We got her, Dad. We got her. I looked at my son, the boy I'd almost lost to a woman who saw people as assets. He was alive. He was scarred, but he was alive. And for the first time in years, the air in Charleston felt clean. But as the paramedics loaded Julian into the ambulance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the police tape. It was Elena. She was watching the fire with a strange, peaceful expression. She caught my eye and gave a small, slow nod. She had her life back. She wasn't a secret anymore. The fire was out. The truth was out. But as I was led back toward the police car, Agent Vance stopped me. "Arthur, there's something you need to see. We searched Sloane's office at the manor while you were out." He pulled a small, charred object from an evidence bag. It was a locket I recognized. It had belonged to Eleanor. "She didn't just want the house, Arthur," Vance said. "She was looking for something else. Something your wife hid in the walls 20 years ago." I felt the world tilt one last time. My wife? Eleanor had been part of this? I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the fire I fought. It was about the one I never saw coming. The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator and the soft hum of the monitors tracking my son's life. I sat in the hard plastic chair, the locket Agent Vance had given me pressed into the palm of my hand. My orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a clean set of clothes Elena had brought me. But I still felt the soot in my pores. I looked at the locket, a small, tarnished silver heart with Eleanor's initials engraved on the front. I'd given this to her on our 10th anniversary. I thought she'd lost it years before she got sick. To find out that Sloane Vance had been scouring my house for it, that she had prioritized this little piece of jewelry over almost everything else, meant it wasn't just a memento, it was a map. I pried the locket open with a trembling thumbnail. Inside, where a photo of Julian should have been, was a tiny, folded piece of vellum, yellowed by time and humidity. I pulled it out and smoothed it across my knee. It wasn't a note. It was a series of coordinates and a single sentence in Eleanor's elegant, flowing script. "The truth is beneath the hearth, where the fire never reaches." I felt a lump form in my throat. Eleanor. My quiet, observant Eleanor. She had spent 30 years being the wife of a firefighter, a woman who lived with the constant fear that her husband wouldn't come home. But she had also been the daughter of a judge, and she knew that in Charleston, the most dangerous fires weren't the ones that burned buildings. They were the ones that burned reputations. I didn't know it yet, but Eleanor had been fighting to protect my legacy long before I even knew it was under attack. I left the hospital for a few hours, with Agent Vance's permission and an officer stationed at Julian's door. I drove back to Trad Street. The house was a crime scene, draped in yellow tape, but it was still standing. I walked through the foyer, past the spots where Sloane had stood and mocked me, and into the formal parlor. I knelt before the great marble fireplace. This hearth had warmed 3 generations of Sterlings. I ran my fingers along the decorative molding at the base, looking for anything out of place. It took me 20 minutes of probing before I felt the slight give of a loose stone. I used a pocket knife to lever it out. Tucked into a hollow space in the masonry was a waterproof metal canister. Inside was a collection of documents that made the room feel like it was spinning. There were original, unedited dispatch logs from the night of the Vance fire. There were bank statements from an offshore account in the name of Preston Vance III. But the most damning piece was a letter, signed and witnessed by a nurse who had been on duty the night I brought Sloane and Elena to the hospital. The letter detailed a bribe. Preston Vance hadn't just paid to hide Elena. He had paid to alter the medical records of the saved girl. Sloane hadn't been under a desk. She had been the one seen in the basement, holding a lighter. She was 7 years old, a child born with a void where a conscience should be. And her father had spent millions to frame his mistake daughter, Elena, and an overzealous firefighter to cover up the fact that his heir was a sociopath. Eleanor had found this out weeks after the fire. She had seen the nurse in a grocery store, a woman drowning in guilt, and Eleanor had done what she did best. She listened. She had gathered the evidence, but she hadn't used it. She knew that if she came forward then, the Vance machine would have crushed our family, so she hid it. She kept it as an insurance policy, a sword in the stone, waiting for the day the Vances came back to finish what they started. I sat on the floor of my parlor, the documents spread around me, and I wept, not for the house, or the fire, or the arrest. I wept for Eleanor, who had carried this secret like a lead weight, protecting me from a truth she knew would break my heart, that the girl I had nearly died to save was the one who had started the fire that killed her own mother. What happened next changed everything, because justice in Charleston doesn't move fast, but when it moves, it's as relentless as the tide. The trial of Sloane Vance was the scandal of the century. The recording Julian had made on the bridge, combined with the evidence from Eleanor's hidden canister, left the defense with nowhere to run. Sloane sat at the defendant's table, her face a mask of cold, haughty indifference, right up until the moment Elena took the stand. Elena didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a survivor. She looked Sloane in the eye and recounted every moment of her hidden life, the way she had been moved from foster home to foster home under false names, the way Garrett Miller had used her as a human ATM, and the way Sloane had laughed when she told Elena that she should have stayed in the basement. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, including the first-degree murder of Garrett Miller and the attempted murder of Julian Sterling, Sloane didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned to me, her eyes as vacant and blue as the ocean, and whispered, "I still hate this house, Arthur." "The house is fine, Sloane," I said, my voice steady. "It's the people inside it you have to worry about." Julian woke up 3 days after the trial ended. The doctors called it a miracle, but I knew better. Julian was a Sterling. We don't go out easy. When he finally opened his eyes and saw me sitting by his bed, he didn't ask about the house or the money. He reached out his hand, his grip weak but certain. "Did we save her, Dad?" he whispered. "We saved the right one this time, son," I said, squeezing his hand. "It took a year to rebuild what Sloane had dismantled. I sold the Piedmont Trust, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I used the money to establish the Eleanor Sterling Foundation for Displaced Children. Elena is the executive director. She finally has a name, a home, and a family that doesn't see her as a mistake." Julian moved back into the house on Trad Street. He's an architect now, but he doesn't talk about erasing the past anymore. He's currently working on a project to restore the old Vance warehouse site into a community center and a memorial for the firefighters of Charleston. He says he wants to build things that are meant to last, things that can't be burned down. I still live on the first floor. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I sit on the porch and watch the tourists walk by, admiring the historic beauty of the Sterling Manor. They see the polished wood and the gleaming brass. They don't see the scars on the joists or the secrets beneath the hearth. I've learned that fire is a strange thing. It can destroy a life in seconds, but it also has a way of tempering the soul. It burns away the wood and the hay, leaving only what is true. I am 63 years old. I have a son who is a hero, a daughter in spirit who is a miracle, and a wife who is still protecting me from the shadows. I touch the scar on my neck. It doesn't itch anymore. It doesn't feel like a brand. It feels like a badge. The moral of the story is something I tell the rookies when I visit the academy. I tell them that you don't always know who you're saving when you go into the smoke. Sometimes you save a devil, and sometimes you save an angel, but you go in anyway, because the fire doesn't get to decide who lives and who dies. You do. And as long as you stand your ground, as long as you protect the people who can't protect themselves, the fire can never really win. I walked back into my house and closed the door. The grandfather clock was ticking. The air smelled of lavender and old books, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the alarm to go off. I was already home.